All right. Welcome to our Google Hangout from the Facubator class of 2019-2020 for Block 1. We are very excited to have with us Felix Ankle as our guest mentor, who's going to be doing a lot of discussions today about professional identity and medical educator 2025, as well as dyadic relationships. So we got a lot of cool stuff to talk about today. So without further ado, I would love to introduce you to one of our co-mentors, Rob Cooney, who can say a little bit about himself, and then we will move on to Felix, our guest mentor.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Rob Cooney. I am the Director of Faculty Development at Geisinger Medical Center in Danville, Pennsylvania, and am also an emergency physician. And I am super excited because today we have Felix Ankle here. And if you haven't had a chance to sit down with Felix, prepare to have your mind blown a little bit. So Felix, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be such a Jedi master of this content that we're going to discuss today.
Oh my. Well, thank you, Abra. I'm totally excited to be here. So my background is I'm an emergency physician. I'm work at Regents Hospital in St. Paul. Have been working there since 1994. Helped set up a residency that we started in 96 and was a program director there from 2020 until 2013, then became the DIO and the VP of our health system until this January. And now I'm chasing around a 4-year-old, have a associate dean position at our medical school, and have a title of medical director for our institute, which is really the school of our health system. The interesting thing of our health system, it's the largest consumer governed healthcare organization in the country, which means our patients vote who's on the board and lead our way. And so we have about 1,700 physicians. We have 5 hospitals, a bunch of clinics, and an insurance plan that covers about 1.2 million lives. We sponsor our own residencies, but also are partnered with the University of Minnesota. We have about 150 FTEs of residents and students and sim centers and libraries and et cetera. So thanks for inviting me.
So Felix, today we picked the topics of the future of professional identity, what a nomad is, and by nomad we mean KNOWMAD, not NOMAD, and then finally to finish with dyadic leadership. The theme of this block has been teaming skills as well as digital collaboration, and I think that this leads really nicely into this concept that you discussed at Cord on the future of professional identity.
Yeah, happy to riff on that. I think it's part of this is just based on my personal experiences I've had and some of the readings is certainly when I trained and worked clinically early on, it was truly about being an expert, having the knowledge, and very much defined myself based on my professional identity. I was a physician. I was an emergency physician. I was the captain of the ship that patients came in and gave some information and something magic happened, and I had some knowledge that I would give to patients, and there was value in that, and patients got better. Similarly, when I was a program director, I think we really focused on knowledge acquisition, is to make sure that all of our residents were the most knowledgeable, that they had as high scores as they could be with the in-training exam, and we celebrated even the high scores on that. I think over the last 20 or 25 years, there's been a movement from sort of a knowledge-based educational system to a competency-based educational system, of which knowledge is just one of 6 core competencies. And I think there's a recognition that knowledge is foundational, but not sufficient to operate in the future. The other thing which is interesting is if you look at sort of the progression from data to information to knowledge to wisdom, is for clinicians, our value proposition was between information to knowledge. I think some of that is being automated. I was just doing a shift a couple weeks ago where even before right when I opened Epic, it already had predictive analytics about sepsis, about what tests I should order, what antibiotics I should prescribe or order. What was interesting was the resident that went and saw the patient found out that the patient was hypotensive, septic, but also didn't want to have heroic measures. Ended up having a surgical abdomen. And so she had a conversation with them about goals of care, about fluids, yes, maybe pressors, but no surgery, no central lines. And looking forward, I think as educators, I think we probably should spend as much effort in training our learners about how to have these shared conversations. And I think our value will be in this space between knowledge and wisdom, which is really a shared space with patients, families, team members, and the rest of society.
That's pretty fascinating because it exactly exemplifies what you're talking about with the wisdom part of it, where when you look at the whole Dreyfus model of competence, AI can't do that human side of things. And that's why we are moving to this whole competency-based medical education system. So it's a great anecdote that illustrates that. What skills do we need to have as educators in order to move from our knowledge-based medical education system into the future competency-based system?
It's interesting when people talk about true change or transitions, it's people focus on what new things or skills you should have, but really change or transitions happens. The limiting factor is what you need to let go of. So in terms of what I think would be a good skill for educators is to let go that they are the experts in knowledge, or letting go of certainty. So as an example, certainly where I was trained, it was important to be certain. But I think this focus on certainty has one of the unintended consequences is maybe a premature dismissal of other people's points of view, which truly is a dismissal of others. And I think the future is an inclusionary future and a shared analysis and synthesis of information. So I think number one is letting go of being the sole harbinger of knowledge. And how does that work is perhaps having a habit of making just a few less declarative statements and asking a few more questions in our activities of daily living or activities of daily education. I also view the educators of tomorrow more as learning choreographers. It's setting the stage, it's setting the learning environment, making sure there's psychological safety for the learning environment. In fact, I would probably say if you are going to profile educational leaders, what for me would be as important when making personnel decision is the ability to promote psychological safety rather than the expertise on the latest RC requirements of something. So I see it's actually pulling back from knowledge and learning, and actually looking at the process of building teams, so that the unit of work is not the individual, the unit of work is the team.
I think you wrote a 1-hour textbook on a lot of these topics. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
So we'll put
I put it together. There's a lot of authors, so we kind of just put it together.
Yeah, and we'll put the link in Slack for the FACUBATs to be able to download this workbook. But you have some wonderful examples in that book on how to do some of this through co-creation and trust networks and things like that. And so how do you go about kind of your role? How do you create those trust networks? How do you build psychological safety in your work teams?
So I think first thing I would say is I am a complete failure in my mind of those things, and so it's a work in progress always. I think the key to psychological safety is actually seeing it and recognizing it, and recognizing when it's not there and perhaps calling it out, and then doing certain techniques. I mean, if you read Amy Edmondson's book, I think it's in there, is the people that truly excel at this can kind of sense who is speaking up and who's not speaking up. I mean, there's great work on, there's some people that are just naturally more introverted and it actually not pulling out from those misses an incredible amount of wisdom for the group. The other things in terms of psychological safety, there are techniques. So I think, Rob, you and I are in a book club with Brene Brown's work. What was interesting was the technique of turn and learn. If there's a question to the group, everyone writes it on a sticky, and then everyone turns it at the same time. So you don't have the first answer, perhaps even on a subconscious level, biasing other answers for this, need to conform or feel. So I think psychological safety is a set of tools and techniques and a recognition of the group to allow ultimately inclusion. I mean, ultimately, I think the best learning environments in the future are the inclusive ones.
In your talk at Cord, you also mentioned kind of this article from Deb Simpson and a few other authors on the job roles of the 2025 medical educator. Yeah. And one of those kind of goes really nicely with this on kind of the role model, the learning environment designer, and the learner-centered navigator. And so I wonder how we can start to put all of this together. We've got kind of Amy Edmondson's work on teaming and this kind of amorphous philosophy where groups come together and then disband. And in our work, I look at that almost at the quintessential examples of the trauma team, where we have to take people from respiratory, trauma, emergency medicine, diagnostic radiology, and put them all into a room together, take care of the patient, and then disband. And it can be really complex to work in that environment with our learners. And so, yeah, how there's a lot of questions there to unpack, I guess. So, as educators, how do we kind of role model this leadership? How do we teach them about complexity and to take that step back and think at a systems level?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think how we behave, in my mind, my personal opinion, is often influenced within the structure that we're in and our roles within that structure, um, and some history. So I would say, in general, we are trained, or I was trained, in sort of this analytic mindset where you take something and you break it down to component pieces and you learn the heck out of these component pieces. And I think that's, I would probably say that at the extreme, there's almost a little bit of OCD on that, that extreme focus on this analytic mindset. I think what happens is, if that analysis is not in a shared space, all the inherent biases that we have, which is anchoring bias, confirmation biases, and all that, has this sort of self-fulfilling feedback loop that it's not one of inclusion, it's one of expertise. I think the future will be probably synthetic thinkers. It is people that see commonalities between areas and put the links together. So in terms of the trauma team, it's very interesting. Our trauma team often work not only because of knowledge, but the structures we're in and the roles we have within these structures. So I don't know, I would tell you, in systems, in trauma teams, there's roles that are sort of emergency medicine roles and surgical roles, and there's sort of a focus on procedures and a lot of dialogue between who's doing what procedure, and a lot of effort around that and other people on the team on the roles, and sort of this analytic way of looking at each role and all that, and that goes within our structure. I'm wondering if the future, an educator would either try to change the structure of the roles, which I don't think would happen easily, or create a different structure just to look at a synthetic method of this. So reflective practice, for example, is, do you do a pre-review, post-review of trauma and how it works? Maybe some reflective. Those are the sort of things where I think what you'll have are things like, after a trauma team resuscitation that involves a death, why don't we all have a minute of silence and to honor the patient? That's a more synthetic way of doing that. It also brings out sort of, hey, how can we do these things better? So it's in a non-persuasive way, rather than how can we do things better as I am, but how can we do things better as we are? So I think the solution is a little bit towards looking at structure and identity and see what works, because we're doing it because it works, but also looking at the unintended consequences during our current structure and identity. So in terms of complexity, managing complexity is actually pretty easy. There's three things. It is alignment, separation, and cohesion, speaking geek. It is always looking for a shared vision, making sure everyone around you is working at their top of the license, and never protecting anybody from information, making sure that all communication is open and transparent, and that there's a shared way of analyzing and synthesizing conclusions.
That last one is the one I think most healthcare leaders have a problem with. And you see this in a lot of our discussions on feedback and evaluation data. And then you read about organizations like Bridgewater Associates and how every conversation is videotaped and kept on a server, and any employee can view every single conversation, and how it's expected that you're going to speak up and call out your leadership on their bad behaviors or misinformation or wrong assumptions and things like that. And I think we're a long way from that type of inclusive environment in healthcare.
There is, but we can nudge. I mean, when I was a residency director, I think everything was open, and we would put it on the web. We would put all of our profiling of our residency, all our RC letters, everything on the web. We would actually also, for example, survey, applicants that could go to our program and chose to go someplace else. And the reasoning behind that, was anonymous. We wouldn't put the names on there, but we put that on our web so that applicants could see why people didn't come to our program rather than why people came. And all of our retreat stuff, all of our is open to anyone. And I think that was an acquired taste for our department, because the fear is, dirty laundry is out there, somebody may misinterpret it. But in fact, people were more and more trusting, and I think trust is part of psychological safety. And we can talk about trust. Is that we always tried. I think as an educator and as a program director, what was interesting was it actually was such a relief to have that, because it wasn't my residency or my information. And there is a couple times where in the residency where I was probably close to burnout, because I was always trying to fix and do that, till someone told me, you know what? You don't have a responsibility for the residency. You have a responsibility to the residency, which is you work hard, you're honest, you learn from your mistakes, and you move on. And I'm like, oh, that seems a lot easier than making sure everything is right and making sure the information isn't misinterpreted. So I think this letting go and really using uncertainty as a gift to be cherished rather than something to be avoided at all cost is maybe a little weird for people at first, but it actually helps the learning environment in my mind.
Mm-hmm. And you did all that through a wiki, if I remember correctly.
It was a wiki.
Yeah. That's how we originally started talking.
Yeah, it was actually also a lot easier just to remember where stuff was. It was all out there. And so you didn't have to remember where it was. You didn't have to remember what piece of information you didn't share and shared. Other than sort of the learner confidential information, we put it out there, not only internally, but also externally. Mm-hmm. The unintended consequences of that is when our applicants came and saw this and we gave them as a book, they often went to other programs and saying, where's your book and where's your stuff? And they're like, my book and stuff, we don't have it. And they're like, well, hey, Regions does this and this and this. And so many of the conversations with other program directors actually centered about, or some of the conversations I heard about them by some of their colleagues, about the region's program. So from a branding point of view, is to have candidates and program directors talk about the program that's not your own is probably a positive unintended consequences of uber transparency.
That's pretty awesome. Abra, have we had any comments from the people who are watching live?
No comments yet, but I actually kind of wanted to build a little bit more on this concept of uncertainty that's been bandied about on Twitter recently, and how it's such a disservice to most of the medical learners that we don't talk about uncertainty and how people should be more comfortable with it. So I was just curious as to any tips that Felix might have for training your learners to embrace uncertainty, and how to really model that as an educator.
So top of mind things is probably baby steps. And we have sort of formal educational processes, the 5-hour didactics and all that. And then we have sort of sometimes little less formal things. So many programs, for example, have a journal club, or a journal club at a faculty's house and everything. And so one of the things we did was we started not only having journal clubs, but also having book clubs and inviting significant others. So every second month, so the 1 month we'd have the typical journal club where you kind of dissect an article in sort of this analytical way, and this little bit of peacocking about who can criticize the article more than someone else, and had that. And then other ones we sometimes we'd have books, and it's interesting. So one of my one of the things I remember was we had a book club, and my mentor, who started the residency at that book club, just reflected on some of the fear and uncertainty he had at some of his shifts. And you could see tears actually in a couple of the interns that they didn't know that other people had that. It changed the whole dynamic of it. And what was interesting was also, a lot of the spouses were there because they want to, or the significant others, they want to see, what this is. It's an open book club from my significant other that I hardly ever see, and I'm over and I want to see what they're in. And so I think, so it's the reflective practice of that. And we started embedding more and more of that. And so we use books a lot as a reflective practice tool. So even at orientation, for example, when I was the DIO of our organization, every resident at orientation got the book Teaming from Amy Edmondson. And usually what happens with these books, they get all their stuff, they bring in the book, and the book is on the bedside table, and the person that reads the book is a significant other, and have that conversations. But at least there's some discussion about that. Our 6-month evals, for example, all the information discussed in the evals was given to the residents before that. And in general, it was a little bit of professional development and using gifting. I would give every resident a book every 6-month evals. And again, at the end of end of the 3 years, there's probably 7 or 8 books the residents would get. At graduation, I would meet the significant others, and they're like, "Oh, I really like that book you gave them, this book and this." But I think managing uncertainty and fear and vulnerability is probably best started outside the traditional way, and then bringing it in would be my recommendations. A long answer to a very great question.
Yeah, I find when you try to do that in the clinical realm, people get uncomfortable very quickly. But as the educator, it's also nice that you can give them that reassurance when you're comfortable with that uncertainty, and to lead by example that way, because technically they're still practicing under your license. And so it's great when they say, well, I'm not comfortable with that. And then you can have the why discussion and kind of talk through it a little bit more.
Well, I link uncertainty with vulnerability. And again, also managing vulnerability as a gift to be cherished, not a force to be managed. And for me, vulnerability is different than disclosure. Some people, in my mind, feel that really being authentic and vulnerable means that you just need to uber disclose everything. I think disclosure, transparency is part of vulnerability, but it's not similar. And I think it's okay as educational leaders to role model vulnerability and uncertainty.
Absolutely. Shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to link our discussion today to the digital tools that we've also been talking about. So social media is a tool for academic productivity and things of that nature. Can you tell us what a nomad is and how that concept relates to the potential future faculty?
Yes, so a nomad, you can look it up with, John Moravec actually introduced that more. And it's ultimately, a nomad is a synthetic thinker where the focus is the knowledge. It's not your role or the structure. And so it's, nomads go to places where I think they learn and provide value. I think they thrive in flat networks because the analysis and synthesis of meaning and information is sort of shared. I think they unlearn as much as they do learn, and they're probably try to fail fast. They probably look for context as much as facts. If it's so interesting, at least when I work in the ED, there's often differences of opinion, and the differences of opinion are usually an interpretation of the same facts in different context. And I look at facts and information and context almost as a fraction, where facts is the numerator and the context is the denominator. And I think nomads really look at the denominator all the time. I think they continuously learn. They're a collaborator. I think there's like 8 or 10 different, and I'm looking at them right now, different characteristics. They probably don't thrive in hierarchies or patriarchal kind of systems or organizations. They're probably fairly good at managing uncertainty.
I was perusing his book, Nomads, which you can download free from their site. And there's a couple of interesting tables in there that he goes to outline kind of where society was and where it is moving towards and how nomads fit in that. And I really enjoyed how he looked at tacit versus explicit knowledge.
Yep.
And we've really focused on a lot of the explicit, but the uncertainty lies with the tacit side of things. And that can only be learned through experience and kind of getting out there and trying it on and doing everything you described with the learning and unlearning and failing and all of that type of stuff. But I was still having some conceptual difficulty with the part that he talks about. They're able to work with anyone, anywhere, anytime. And, we still are a service specialty where, emergency medicine is provided in an emergency department. But then I got thinking, well, maybe that's not exactly where the future is going. And as we see the rise of digital health and even the locums culture that's out there, maybe there are going to be nomadic emergency physician faculty members who travel from program to program or offer their services in a digital realm.
Well, I mean, I think conceptually, trauma teams are nomadic teams. That they're and nomadic teams in terms of time and space, maybe not in essence. But they're in different places. They all come together around a common purpose and hopefully learn. I would say it's a little bit more hierarchical than true nomadic teams, but Nancy Dixon just put a nice blog post on sort of the future of structures and all that. And I think a lot of our roles have been based on structures meant for manufacturing companies. So if you're making widgets, how we operate, it works very well. From a geek point of view, is in my mind, there's a difference between complicated and complex systems. So you have simple systems, which is like baking bread, I would say. You have a recipe, you put these things together, put it in the oven, you got bread. Complicated system is probably like putting a person on the moon. You have all these component parts and you have that. Complex system is like raising a child. Is that you can have the book or the manual, but it's not doing that. And the value of complicated systems are the value of the sum of the parts. Whereas the value of complex systems is the sum of the connection between the parts. And so I think that the best way to manage complexity is have an environment that you increase the number and the bidirectionality of the connection between the people and parts. And I think nomads, if you want to label them, probably are operating that system easier. I think for some, being in a highly structured environment is important. And having those boundaries of what you should do, what you shouldn't do, who's gonna give you the feedback on how you're doing and all that. But the reality is a lot of this knowledge work is going to be automated with augmented intelligence. And I think the future of managing complexity is truly looking at non-binary roles. So it's very interesting. I was always put in binary. Are you a suit or are you a clinician? Are you this or you're that? I'm like, well, I am a suit, but I also work clinical. And people are like, well, this whole concept of otherness, you're either with me or other, it is worked well when we're in tribes of 30 living in caves. It doesn't work in the information age. Bottom line.
Yeah. And that kind of leads me to my questions on dyadic leadership.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So dyadic leadership is old. Mm-hmm. Even in Rome, you had like the Republican. I can't remember. You had two houses. More and more health systems are going into dyadic leadership. So I can tell you that my first introduction to dyadic leadership was from arm's length, seeing a department that was trying to work on a dyadic leadership system. And that looked like a lot of work and a lot of dysfunction. So I probably was, probably could see the potential downfalls of that. But then in one of my jobs where I was a VP, started having a dyadic leadership. And that was probably the most amazing experience I had. That for following reasons. One was a different skill set and strengths. Two was different networks. And three, it was in terms of the quality of the decision making. It was a good foil on a lot of biases, but they're really anchoring confirmation biases. And so it really made decision making easy. It made, for example, building a trust network really easy. So I would probably suggest for anyone, given the choice of being solo or single, or to have sort of a professional dyad partner, I'm a firm believer in dyads.
And just for the faculty who don't know what a dyadic leadership structure is, can you just explain that?
Yeah, so the traditional model is in these integrated health systems, a physician leader is connected with a non-physician leader. Mm-hmm. So so Mayo was, that was last 80 years they have that, our health partner system. But it doesn't always need to be that. I would, from our institute at Health Partners has a dyadic leadership, which is two non-physicians. My gut tells me that some program directors actually functionally operate and lead the residency as a dyadic leadership structure with their program manager. But it's a shared accountability authority model and the shared responsibility resources model. So it's less transactional and more relational.
How do you think that has affected kind of the shared understanding? So one of the issues that we're wrestling with at our institution is showing the value of the residents within the clinical service lines. And we're brainstorming a program where we actually create these dyads, bringing in kind of the administrative leader with the educational leader to create educational administrative dyads in order to gain that shared understanding and appreciation for each other's roles instead of the silos that currently exist.
I think that's brilliant. Inclusion, it's brilliant. It's inclusive. True integration and true inclusion is inconvenient. If it's not inconvenient, it's just an interest. It's not a commitment. And so I think that would be I think that would be transformational. So much when you work in hierarchies, there's all these triangles, and so much if the information flow is in a hierarchy, there's this whole issue of otherness, is that if this is just my opinion in general, when people feel unsafe in a hierarchy, there is often sort of a a search for attribution. And that attribution is usually not in the room.
Yeah.
It's harder if there's a dyad thing. So I think, Rob, you reviewed a book on coaching. I can't remember the author. The website is Box of Crayons.
Mm-hmm.
If you buy the book, there's these little 5-minute videos on coaching. And what is interesting to me are the 3 little videos on Cartman's triangle, where you often have sort of the persecutor, and then you have the victim, and then you have the savior, but those roles all go around. And I truly think that separateness does have a purpose for many people. You know, if you're separate, you may feel less vulnerable, because the story you have in your head is a very clear story. And you don't need to challenge the story you have in your head with knowing more about the situation, or knowing more about the person, or knowing more about yourself. And so what's fascinating to me is I think the trend is towards more dyadic leadership, which I think for people that have grown up in sort of this patriarchal command and control system, I think will be a pivot and a change.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. So as we come to the end of our discussion, Abra, do you have any questions from the participants yet?
Yes, we have one. Circling back to vulnerability, Brian Barbas wanted to know if you had any suggestions for incorporating this earlier on in medical education, particularly in the medical school curriculum, so that this is not us taking formed adult learners and trying to force them into this concept of being comfortable with vulnerability once they hit residency.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think so. In some senses, some medical schools are even ahead of the game. You know, what's interesting, so as an example, we had a citywide sort of reflective sort of moth hour type thing that we have a little consortium of the GME directors and all that. And we had it at a I think it was a microbrewery, and we thought 20 people would show up. 140 did, and we had to turn people away. And so, and the stories that were told blew my mind. Amazing stories about that. So I think medical schools are doing that. My personal thought is, when I have a moth hour at medical school, you know, is rather than have one less biochem lecture a month and one more moth hour, as an example, I do think it's part of, I don't think it's part of the, I think part of the leadership and the educators, again, are the learning choreographers. It's setting up the stage for people to do this. It's not, hey, I'm going to give you a lecture on vulnerability. Here's Brené Brown vulnerability. Here's Man Search for Meaning. Read that and tell me 3 things and all this kind of stuff. So it's coming. And if it's not happening, it's going to happen outside of the usual structures. Great question.
So I think that's all of our questions from the audience. We have probably just a few minutes if you have any closing thoughts before we wrap up. I think you've delivered a ton of information, which is really awesome for all of our FacuBabies and anyone who is going to watch this, not live in the future. But any closing thoughts?
No, so first of all, thanks for having me on. It's a complete honor. And I think this is the most incredible time to be an educator, is really when hierarchies are turning into networks. and where identities are moving from binary identities to quantum identities, where you can actually be a particle and a waveform at the same time, and really where the focus will be on being in a shared space. So much I think of professional distress, I think, is actually professional loneliness, or the feeling of disconnectedness, which is treated with busyness, and that we're developing people for performance, or we're coaching people for performance rather than development. So it's changing right now, and it's changing rapidly. So it's an incredible time to be an educator. So thank you.
Thank you, Felix. As always, it's wonderful to be a Padawan sitting at the feet of you as a Jedi Master. So let's do it again sometime.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for all you do with the Faculty Incubator.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.